Hello, welcome to another episode of Outermost Uncle. Tonight is a chat on the government report. It's a report surrounding my uncle William Scales' disappearance in the Bahamas in 1958. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's because you haven't followed consecutive order on these things. And if you start at number one, you're going to be way better off. But this is cool. So you get to see that the government report came to me. It's straight out of the National Archives. And it's kind of, the pages look like this. It's just copies. And I cropped them down and made them more readable, clearer. The report itself is at least 53 pages. There's more, but you don't need more than that. And it starts out, there was confusion, and I've mentioned this before. My grandmother was trying to get information about her son, and there was confusion about San Salvador Island being San Salvador, El Salvador at first, and then the correct place, San Salvador, Bahamas. So the government report has this whole pile of paperwork, operations memorandum, memorandums of conversations. It's back and forth with Representative Clevenger's secretary, Drake. And I've kind of, instead of reading all this stuff, because it gets tedious and boring, I kind of made a script, and I took some liberties. For one, I made Secretary Drake into a female, and we have that little script. And my friend Judith Altruda, a silversmith, artist, author, she has agreed to read that, and so I recorded her doing that, and that was really cool. And then something else I was going to say about that, but I can't remember it right off. I'll remember it later. It won't make sense. So, and then guess who's coming up after that? J.A. Ward is the security superintendent from the Guided Missile Range Division, Patrick Air Force Base. Well, he's not that now, but he wrote up a thing in the report. And my husband, Robert Merrill, is reading that tonight. He's bowling tonight, but he's in this video recording. And what he basically does is he has to write the entire thing. Like he encapsulates the whole thing. He gathers together the eyewitness reports, like the depositions and stuff, and then he writes what happened and I think he wrote, I'll have to reread it, but I think he wrote like what his findings are, and then also like Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, different items that they found, and also eyewitness reports are also, those are exhibits. So we also have, I pulled out two of those eyewitness reports, and because I just kind of randomly thought from two different perspectives, it could be interesting. So we have one guy who was an eyewitness, Charles Schillinger, and he is the medical recreation supervisor at San Salvador Army Air Force Base. He is played by Captain Pete Dara of the Maritime Museum down in Raymond. Captain Pete is Marine, ex-Marine I want to say, but it's Marine, and he's turns 90 this year, so he's playing a much younger man, and he can pull it off. So he'll be reading that one. And then Mark Murphy of Mark Murphy Miniatures. He does this guy. This is how he makes his living too. He makes 1/12 scale furniture of like really classic, famous pieces, and like museums consign or contract with him to make these miniature pieces. Anyway, crazy way to make a living. He's playing R.L. Gatz, and R.L. Gatz was a colleague of my uncle's. And so I just thought that would be a nice variety of things. You don't need the whole government report. So you're getting it right now. You don't have to read it. You can just listen to it.
In July, I began seeking information regarding the alleged death of William Scales, an American citizen, on June 25th or 26, 1958, as the result of a drowning accident at San Salvador. Based on a telephone call from a friend of the decedent's family, unknown to me, the decedent was boating with a companion. I have no status as to the remains. Whether or not the remains were recovered or buried at San Salvador is unknown. The family reports no information concerning the death has ever been forwarded. I am requesting the assistance of the Department of State in having the embassy at San Salvador conduct an investigation and to provide Representative Clevenger with the results of the embassy's investigation. Again, on August 4th, I called the U.S. State Department regarding the death of William Scales on June 28th or 29th, 1958, near the Isle of San Salvador, also known as Watlings Island. I stated that in view of the report that the department had received from the American Embassy at San Salvador, El Salvador, regarding the foregoing alleged death of William Scales, I checked further with the decedent's mother, Mrs. Rufus Scales of Archbold, Ohio. I wanted to further check the exact location of the death of her son. Mrs. Scales reported that the death occurred off the Isle of San Salvador in the Bahamas Islands, and the State Department had gone to the wrong consular jurisdiction. I requested the State Department to direct the same inquiry to the American consulate at Nassau, Bahamas. I was advised that I would be informed immediately, as I emphasized that the decedent's family was concerned over the lengthy delay. I again phoned the Department of State multiple times, and on August 25th, I was informed the consulate at Nassau, Bahamas, was placed in charge of conducting an investigation into the death of William Scales. I again called on August 29th. I was disturbed that no information had been forthcoming about the disappearance of William Scales, who was employed by the Radio Corporation of America. I again informed them of William and his partner Deal's location and manner of death. I was informed that Deal's family had been flown down to Nassau by their son's employer, the General Electric Corporation, and that a funeral was conducted. I was told that I might wish to call long distance to the Air Force Base in Cocoa, Florida, in view that Scales was apparently working on a missile test project from the base. Finally, the report arrived.
Patrick Air Force Base, 8 July 1958. Apparent drowning, San Salvador Army Air Force Base. An investigation was conducted at San Salvador Army Air Force Base from 1 to 3 July 1958 to determine the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of William A. Scales, RCA technician, and Donald Deal, GE technician, while out skin diving. On 1 July 1958, Mr. R.A. von Melker, acting base manager, was interviewed and stated in substance. On 28 June 1958, at about 1900 hours, von Melker was notified that two men, William Scales and Donald Deal, were out in the Pan American Airways boat skin diving. He was not too much concerned, as he knew both men were capable skin divers. The empty boat could be observed about 1/2 mile from the base launching area. As it became dark, Van Melker became concerned and notified Mr. J.S. Kaprowski, RCA instrumentation manager, that one of his men was out and it was dark. Von Melker organized a search party with C.F. Schillinger in charge. Schillinger and party returned and reported the boat was anchored about 3/4 of a mile. The boat was unoccupied. A search of the surrounding area was conducted, but no sign of Scales or Deal could be found. At 22:45 hours, von Melker, with a party, searched the beach for approximately 2 miles with negative results. The search for the two men was discontinued until the next morning. At approximately 0800 hours on 29 June, the search continued with base personnel using aqualungs and snorkels. The Navy joined in the search using an LCVP landing craft. The search continued until about 1200 hours without any sign of the missing men. At 12:15 hours, an Air Force plane, C-47, departed and searched the beaches and ocean. At 13:07 hours, this search ended with negative results. At approximately 1300 hours, R.L. Gatz, while diving in the area the men disappeared from, found a spear gun at a depth of about 125 feet. The search continued throughout the afternoon with negative results. A camera was found in the boat and was identified as belonging to Scale. This camera was turned over to J.S. Kaprowski, RCA instrumentation manager. On 1 and 3 July 1958, C.F. Schillinger, base medic recreation supervisor, was interviewed and furnished a signed statement. Exhibit A. In addition, he stated in substance, Scales and Deal were both familiar with the policy that permission to use the boat must be obtained before taking it, as a memorandum was on a bulletin board outlining the policy and using the recreational equipment. A copy of the memorandum is attached. Exhibit B. Schillinger said that Scales was involved once before in using the boat without permission. He said that about 3 weeks ago he was talking to Scales and Deal about deep diving. He informed them that he did not know too much about what could happen to persons when deep diving, and then he certainly did not have any equipment to treat a person who might get into trouble while deep diving. He advised Scales and Deal at this time not to do any deep diving. He said that in prior conversations with Scales, he learned that Scales had received psychiatric treatment for depressed feelings. Schillinger found no indication of foul play when he examined the boat. On 2 July 1958, Mr. R. L. Gatz was interviewed and furnished a signed statement regarding his search for the missing men. Exhibit C. On 1 July 1958, J. S. Kaprowski, RCA Instrumentation Manager, was interviewed and stated that William Scales was returning to Patrick Air Force Base on Monday, 30 June 1958, for termination of his employment. Kaprowski turned over the roll of film found in Scales' camera, which was left in the boat. The film was developed and was found to be negative. Exhibit D. On 1 and 2 July 1958, J. A. Reese, Russell J. Howard, James A. Reeve Jr., and A. L. Kemp were interviewed and furnished signed statements regarding Scales and Deal's disappearance, actions and conversations before disappearance. Exhibits E, F, G, H. On 1 July 1958, Richard K. Sutter, RCA technician at San Salvador, was interviewed and stated in substance. At about 17:30 hours on 28 June 1958, he helped William Scales and Donald Deal place their gear in a recreation boat. Scales and Deal were talking about some fish they had seen earlier in the day. They both seemed normal and were not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. They departed from the base launching dock. On 1 July 1958, Jack Kramer, Pan American Airways cook, was interviewed and stated that he was one of the group which was out with Reese skin diving that afternoon of 28 June. Kramer furnished substantially the same information as Reese regarding the conversations between Scales and Reese on their return from the skin diving. On 1 July 1958, Mr. Russell Reed, Pan American Airways Assistant Logistics Manager, Patrick Air Force Base, arrived at San Salvador Army Air Force Base with 2 divers. Mr. Reed was interviewed and stated that they searched the adjoining area where the boat was found anchored but did not find any trace of Scales or Deal. During the investigation, there was no information found regarding possible suicide or foul play. Several persons who skin dive were interviewed, and they were of the opinion that at 300-foot depth is deep for skin divers, as several things are unsafe at that depth. On 2 July 1958, Elrod Corr, GE technician, and Douglas Powell, GE technician, were interviewed and stated in substance. Powell was Deal's roommate. On Friday night, 27 June 1958, Scales was in a room talking to Deal. In their conversation, they implied that they had seen some large Jewfish on one of their dives and intended to dive for the fish. Scales and Deal said they had obtained 270 feet in depth on their previous dives and were going to try for 300 feet in depth. On 3 July 1958, Kirk, RCA technician, San Salvador, was interviewed and stated that he roomed with Scales about 2 weeks prior to Scales' disappearance. He last saw Scales about noon on 28 June. Scales seemed to be normal. A day or two before Scales and Deal's disappearance, Scales was saying that he and Deal were going to try to dive the depth of 300 feet, as that would break the record of any of their other dives. They were planning to carry extra air when they attempted this deep dive. Prior to going skin diving, Scales was careful as to the meals he ate. He appeared to be normal when last seen about noon on 28 June 1958. Findings. William A. Scales, RCA employee, and Donald Deal, GE employee, San Salvador Army Air Force Base, took the Pan American Airways recreation boat at about 17:30 hours on 28 June 1958 without permission. Scales and Deal, from prior conversation with others, intended to go out and try to dive to a depth of 300 feet. Scales and Deal disappeared while out skin diving. A search was conducted without finding Scales or Deal. Unverified conclusion. William A. Scales and Donald Deal, while skin diving on 28 June 1958, disappeared while making a deep dive and probably drowned. This conclusion is derived from information contained in this report based on the intent of the two individuals prior to their disappearance. J. A. Ward, Secretary, Superintendent, Pan American Airways, RCA Investigator, Guided Missile Range Division.
On the morning of June 28, 1958, W.A. Scales and D.J. Deal requested the use of the Pan American Airways boat. As J.A. Reese, weather supervisor, requested the boat between 1200 and 1700. I informed Scales to return in time to turn over the boat to him. Scales and his group used the boat until noon, then turned it over to Reese as scheduled. At approximately 1745, Reese told me he had brought the boat back on time, but Scales and Deal insisted on taking it out again. I mentioned that they had not asked for or received permission to use the boat after 1700 hours. Reese stated that he and others tried to discourage Scales and Deal from going out in the boat. Since I was preparing to board the spray plane to help direct the pilot to some swamp areas, I gave the incident no more thought. I intended to reprimand the two men for taking the boat out without permission. After returning from the spray run at approximately 1845 hours, I took the crew to their quarters. After a shower of the two pilots and I went to the club, the time was approximately 1930 hours. Mr. J. Koprowski, RCA Instrumentation Manager, informed me that one of his men was still out in the boat. I contacted Mr. Von Melcher, Acting Base Manager, and he stated that Scales and Deal should be back and have had enough time for grace. A search party was organized to boat out to the anchored PTA boat located approximately 1/3 of a mile offshore near the base site. L. Mashburn, T. Carr, T. Tuttle, and myself proceeded to the anchored boat. Except for the miscellaneous gear of the boat, we found no signs of Scale or Deal. Mashburn and I dove overboard and, with the help of a battery-operated searchlight, looked for the two missing men. The water was 50 to 60 feet deep, rendering underwater visibility impossible for more than a few feet. While Mashburn and I stayed in the PAA boat, Tootle and Carr searched the surrounding area in a 1/4 mile radius of the boat. After an hour's search, I told the men we should return to the base as it was futile to search in the dark waters. Search parties were organized to check the boat area from Cockburn Town to Victorian Hills. Several men checked the local towns. Preliminary plans were made for further search in the morning. Early in the morning of June 29, 1958, R. Von Melcher, L. Mashburn, T. Tuttle, F. Connor, and R. Howard, T. Towbridge, T. Carr, and I boated to the anchored PAA boat. We searched the waters beneath and around the boat, and due to the strong tidal currents, deep water, and poor visibility, it was difficult to search the area. We tried trolling slowly with two men attached to a tow line as observers. This method made it possible to get a general picture of the area. A few hundred feet from the anchored boat, and the water dropped off to hundreds of feet. At 1,000 hours, I returned to the base area to board a spray plane for an air search of the area. The pilot picked up a heading along the direction of the sea current and followed it out for 30 miles. We flew in circles and patterns along the beach and out to sea. We saw no evidence of the missing men. The air search lasted about 45 minutes or more. C.F. Schillinger. Medical Research Recreational Supervisor, San Salvador Army Air Force Base.
I'm an employee of Pan American Airways. At about 5 p.m. on Saturday, June 28, 1958, I spoke with William Scales at the boat landing area of the San Salvador Army Air Force Station in front of the mess hall. 5 other men and I had just come in from spearfishing. Scales came running down to the beach, requesting us to leave the boat in the water, as he and Donald Deal wanted to go out deep diving with aqualungs. Several of the men in my party intimated to Scales that it was rather late to go out for deep diving as it would soon be dark, but he seemed determined to go. We unloaded our gear from the boat and left it anchored near the shore. We then went into the mess hall and ate supper. When we came out, the boat was gone. I assumed Scales and Deal went out in the boat, but I did not actually see them. I can't recall anyone saying that they were present and saw Scales and Deal leaving the boat. At about 8 p.m., I was watching the movies when I suddenly saw the fire truck drive out of the beach. Several men seemed to be making ready to launch a boat. I went out to the beach, and from the general conversation of the crowd who were standing around, I gathered that the 2 men, Scales and Deal, had not returned and that another boat was launched to send a party out in search of them. I remained in the general area until the search party had returned, but they said that they saw nothing of the men. The loaded spear gun found at 125 feet of depth was probably dropped when the men were attempting to reach the surface, but could not make it. At least it would indicate that the one who dropped it was not attacked by any creature while he was alive and conscious, for in such an event he would most likely have fought the attacker, wouldn't he? And the gun would have been unloaded, wouldn't it? However, whether they died by drowning or were killed by some denizen of the deep, I am reasonably sure they are both dead.